Hello. Hello, welcome to this webinar, part of Global Horizons virtual series brought to you by Oxford Analytica and the Conference Board. I'm Amalia Khachaturian, Deputy Director of Advisory at Oxford Analytica, and today we'll be looking at the policy consequences of the United States elections, depending who wins on November the 3rd. A few words on the CPE credits that are available for this webcast. To claim them, you must stay for the entirety of the webcast. And then at the end, click on the link you can see in the Claim CP Credit section for the platform. You must be registered for the event and logged in using your Conference Board account. And you must also click on the 3 pop-ups that will appear during the course of the webcast. So I hope that's clear, but if any questions, feel free to ask my colleagues and they will direct you. Our discussion today will be divided into 4 thematic sections, and for each we'll start with a poll, ask a few questions, and then get on discussing the key issues and policy consequences of the different outcomes of the elections with our speakers. And the sections are on the economy and macroeconomic policy, domestic politics, relations with China and defense policy, foreign policy, and markets. So the entire webcast will be for 90 minutes. And I have the pleasure to also introduce our distinguished panel. Mark Cliff, Global Head of the New Horizons Hub at ING Group. Bart van Ark is Executive Vice President and Global Chief Economist at the Conference Board. Harvey Chen is Chairman of the Advisory Board and the Center for Creative Leadership, Greater China. Trevor McCreason is an Associate Director in U.S. Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. And James Knightley is the Chief International Economist at the ING Group. I will be later joined by my colleague Nick Redman, Director of Analysis at Oxford Analytica. And before then, I'll say a few words to set the scene, what we'll be discussing today, and pass on to Mark Cliff to say a few words about our collaboration with the Conference Board and Oxford Analytica. So the elections, obviously the outcome everybody has been discussing to be the most consequential in decades, given the massive agenda that the US administration will face over the next 4 years, from economic recovery to rising China to dealing with the Congress and the Supreme Court that are working on key policy changes. And the choices made will have profound impacts not only on the United States, but also the rest of the world. And today, Oxford Analytica and the Conference Board have teamed up with the ING Group to examine the potential election outcomes and consequences. As usual, we are taking the scenario approach, and more about that you'll read in our report produced with the ING Group, and later on you'll see on your screens, and you can download from our websites, both at Oxford Analytica and the ING Group. But today we're not going to call the election results or predict who will win, but rather look at the aftermath of the elections and try to understand what the different outcomes will bring and what consequences those outcomes may have. And with that, and about more about our relationship with the ING and the series that we have been producing, I'll pass on to Mark Cliff, Global Head of the New Horizons Hub at ING, to say a few more words. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Amalia. On behalf of ING, I would like to thank the Conference Board and Oxford Analytica for teaming up with us to put this webinar together. I'm sure you'll agree this is a very timely event, and I'd really just like to take a few moments to give you some of the background on ING's approach and thinking, and on why we teamed up with Oxford Analytica on the reports. The New Horizons Hub at ING develops, curates and communicates research on disruptive themes such as climate change, digital innovation and geopolitics. These are all topics that economic forecasters have struggled with over the years. Politics, I think you'll agree, is particularly tricky. It has an unpredictable, often binary quality. I mean, after all, elections, like wars, are won and lost. These are not the marginal changes that economists tend to focus on. And over the years, I've found that economic forecasters don't do politics, and political analysts don't do forecasts. So in order to bridge that gap, we decided to team up with Oxford Analytica. ING has been a client of Oxford Analytica for many years, and we obviously respect the depth of their expertise in political analysis. And I think with the Trump administration coming towards the end of its first term and the radical changes that we've seen in policy as a result of the Trump administration, we decided that we needed to look at the potential scenarios for the US elections and the aftermath. Now, as Amalia has mentioned, in true scenario planning style, we are not obsessing about the probability of potential outcomes, but rather focusing on the impact. Because if you think back to what happened 4 years ago, very few people predicted that Trump would win, but even fewer people predicted what would happen if he did. So that's why we've been producing a series of reports entitled US Political Watch in collaboration with Oxford Analytica. And as Amalia mentioned, we published the latest yesterday. It's called A Pivotal Election, and indeed you should be able to access this freely. It's available on ING's website already, which is ing.com. So please take a look at that. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing whether or not this indeed is going to be a turning point for the world. So back to Amalia. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think we'll start with the discussion, and for that, the way we want to organize this discussion today is, first of all, we will have a poll, a very brief poll, and we invite everybody to cast their vote. We'll summarize the votes and comment on that for a very brief period of time, and then continue discussing the key issues per the thematic topics that we outlined earlier. So let's start with the first poll, and we go into the US economy and macroeconomic policy with Bart van Ark. So I'm hoping that you see the poll question on your screens. The outcome of the election will make the biggest difference in 3 policy areas. So pick your 3 policy areas, and you see, we'll try to see the results. Maybe we give another minute and close the poll after 1 minute. Yeah, shall we close the poll and show the results? Great. I think everybody now sees the results, and they are quite interesting. And I'll ask, before we go to Bart, I'll ask James to come in with a very brief comment. Does this relate to what you were thinking?
It does, actually. Yeah, it does differ quite a lot from what I was expecting. You know, I thought there'd be sort of a bit more on taxes, a bit more on regulation as well. And I think I understand why those are somewhat lower, because of course I don't think they're going to be the priorities of a new administration of either hue. So I personally thought that infrastructure would be much higher, because of course we know that infrastructure has been a key theme of presidents for multiple decades. It just hasn't materialized. I just sense that if we do get a split Congress, that could be one area where you actually do get potential agreement, because let's face it, both sides, you know, the contrast couldn't be starker between the two candidates on all of these issues. I then thought government spending would be a bit stronger because, we see what the Republicans are pushing for, we see what the Democrats are pushing for. I thought that would have been potentially an area where we do see big changes. And also, I would certainly agree that energy and climate policy is going to be a big story, but that also can then tie back in with infrastructure. But I'll be very interested to hear what Bart has to say on this.
Great, thank you so much, James. Bart, over to you. I think the trade policy wins, but over to you for your comments and remarks.
Thanks, Amalia. And first of all, congratulations to Oxford Analytica and ING for this quite interesting report. I had the pleasure of seeing an early draft of it and could dive a little bit more deeper into it. And I think it's great to look at these various scenarios, particularly at the time that we don't know what the outcome is, and then that's the time that scenarios are really useful. I am also a little surprised, like James, about these poll results, although I think we have to realize that this morning, we're speaking particularly to a Asia and Europe audience, so I think we're a little bit more, most of our audience is looking outside in, and then obviously trade is going to be a very important component. Later today, we're actually repeating this webcast for a US audience, and we'll be interested to compare the results at that time. So I think that is one of the reasons. I think what I take it is there are really a couple of really big policy areas that will make a difference. And that's interesting because when we look at the campaign, this is a campaign that there's actually not a heck of a lot of discussion about policy, particularly on the side of President Trump. There's not a lot of detail on policy. He's never had a view of outlining too much detailed policy analysis and really develop it sort of down the road. And even though the Biden campaign is, of course, talking a little bit more about it, it's still at a pretty high level, and the discussion around policy between the two camps is relatively limited. What I want to do in my opening comments really is to say a couple of things. There are sort of 5 factors that really determine sort of the immediate impact of the election outcome out of the gate. And 3 of them are directly related to the coronavirus, interestingly enough. So first of all, the first factor is just the evolution of the virus itself. A president or an administration can't do much about that, but of course we have already seen around the world that different approaches on containing the virus can make a lot of difference on how this is playing out. So whatever a president does to contain the virus or basically cede power over to the virus as it is, I think it's going to be quite important in the first year or two, unless you believe that the vaccine is miraculously going to let this problem go away in the next few months. It's more likely that this issue is going to be with a new administration for at least a year or perhaps even 2 years and heavily dominating on the agenda. Somewhat related to that is actually the availability of treatments and vaccines. Again, that's not entirely in the hands of a new administration. However, particularly the US government can play a big role in making that vaccine available and how widely it is available within the United States, but also around the rest of the world. And it can have a big impact on international collaboration on how that is going to be played. So I think that's a second factor where, a new presidency and a new administration can make a lot of difference for the US and the rest of the world. And the third factor, of course, is how to deal with the economic impacts of the coronavirus. And that really goes to the question about to what extent will we see an additional recovery package or a stimulus package coming out of the gate shortly after the elections. Both camps have been talking about more stimulus. The Biden campaign probably talking about a significantly larger package than the Trump campaign. We can just discuss it in a little bit more detail. Now, the 4th and the 5th have nothing to do with the coronavirus and are, of course, very important. One, of course, is who's going to control the Senate. Because the Senate will ultimately determine, whether we can, to what extent, Congress and Senate has power over what the presidency is going to do. There is a possibility that we would have a right out complete democratic control in the White House, in the House, and in the Senate. If that were the case, even then, it's probably going to still be a question how large that majority would be and how much can be done. So the Senate is critical in terms of determining whether there's a lot of room for economic policy or whether there's limited room. And I don't think it's really about is the Senate going to be controlled by Democrats, but how much and how slim is that majority going to be. So the Senate part, I think, is very important. And the 5th factor is the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is supposed to be independent of the administration, and it's trying to do, and we hope it will continue to do. But of course, the Federal Reserve is responding to the way that policy is being developed and emerging in the economy. And the question is to what extent the Fed chair will take the room and the liberty to influence policies as they're going to emerge. So those 5 factors, I think, are very important to take into account. Second point I would make is that the next president, and this is specifically the president, has a lot of impact on what is happening on the global economy. Going back to the vote results, or the poll results a minute ago, trade policy, or basically foreign policy in general of its trade, is very important. The president has a lot of sway over. Congress has delegated a lot of power here to executives, and we have of course seen in the previous administration how important trade policy has become. But of course we have 2 major factors that are now adding to that sort of international policy agenda. One is climate, which James already mentioned, and the engagement of the US administration in climate agreements is very much in the hands of the president, and we can see a large difference there in way that the Trump administration or a Biden administration would handle this. And the next one, which is somewhat unexpected, but again related to COVID, is health. And that is the relationship of the United States with the WTO, and also relating a little bit back to the issue of the distribution of vaccines and the accessibility to vaccines. So this is really important. The president has a lot of sway on these kind of policy portfolios. And also domestically, the president can do a lot in terms of regulation, particularly in the case of a divided Congress. The president is more likely to make use of executive powers, whether it's going to be President Biden or President Trump. So that will have an impact on regulations, on domestic security and immigration issues, on the nomination of judges or central bankers, and so on and so forth. The third and my final point, and then I'll stop for a moment and invite some other comments, is that we can talk a lot about policy ideas, and we as economists do a lot of calculations about what the impact of some of these policy packages is going to be. But ultimately, it will all depend a little bit on, the impact of these policies will be as good as their guts and the multipliers. And by which I mean, it really depends on what is exactly going into these policy proposals, and will the president be able to get these policy proposals entirely through, and what are ultimately what we economists call the multipliers of these policy proposals. Multipliers for a non-economic audience means that every dollar that you put into a policy proposal, how many dollars is this going to give you back? So for example, infrastructure is a good example where economists generally think that the multiplier is pretty high, and therefore any kind of dollar you spend on infrastructure could have quite a bit of impact on the economy. I agree with James that that is an important portfolio. Both presidents have been talking about it. President Trump's proposals are much more limited than the Biden administration proposal. President Trump is only talking about $1 trillion infrastructure spending from public money over a period of 8 years, whereas Biden is talking about sort of $2.5 to $3 trillion money over a period of 4 years. So this is really making a huge difference. Multipliers are very high. But again, it all depends where is infrastructure exactly going. Are we spending it on technology infrastructure, which has high multipliers, or are we spending it on filling potholes, which is very necessary, but the multipliers of it are not all that high. So these factors are really, really playing a role. If you take it all together, if you simply look at the amount of spending that the Biden campaign is proposing, taking the multipliers into account, you're talking about $9 trillion about spending proposals. You talk about a $4 trillion in terms of additional revenue. That means that there is a real sort of direct stimulus to the economy. This is very, very large, much larger than in the case of the Trump administration. So if you just look at these numbers as such, you would say that the economic impact of the Biden proposal will be significantly bigger. But it all depends on what exactly is going into the proposals, how much will get passed, what are the sort of negative side effects that might come with some of these proposals. Some of them are very daring proposals, and therefore it's much less certain at the end of the day which administration will really give us most of the economic growth. So let me stop there in terms of opening comments, and sure we'll come back to some of these topics later on in the discussion.
Well, thank you. Can I ask you a first question around employment? I can't hear me.
No, we cannot hear it.
maybe you make the volume higher, Nick, on your side. No. Yeah, we are having slight technical problems. Hopefully, Nick will be able to join us with the technology. You had very interesting points, Bart, and what I would like you to elaborate, you talked really very deeply in terms of the differences between the Biden and Trump administration, and I would like you to sort of expand on the key policy areas that you think will make Biden's and Trump's priorities in the first few years of the next administration, given that we're expecting 2022 elections, and what do you think, how much will be done in those 2 years, given how wide the spectrum is for Biden, and if Trump will continue with his policy priorities and how it will diverge in different areas of macroeconomic policy?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the first year or perhaps even 2 years will still be dominated very much by the COVID-19 coronavirus crisis. And even if we get this crisis under control, the economic recovery that has to come from the economic damage that has been done and the recovery that we need to see will dominate the agenda. So the first thing out of the gate is what will happen in terms of additional stimulus. Even though in practice, we'll be talking about taxes and things like that. Taxes is not, although it's very important from a longer term policy issue, in the short term, that's not going to be the issue that any of these presidents is going to touch. It's all about where is the stimulus going to go. Trump has proposed already that he would like to see more in terms of employment support, dealing with sort of earned income tax credits and things like that. So he will try to really focus on sort of making sure that more employment is coming back and is coming back faster. The Biden administration has a much broader agenda, and we'll see how much they can actually get on the plate. The sooner the better. I think is going to be very important in this respect. So I think in the first period, it's all going to be about Corona. The other second and important thing is, of course, and we'll talk about it in more detail on the U.S.-China relationship, is the trade policy area. There will, in a way, it still remains to be seen how large the actual difference is in the way that both administrations are thinking about the role of the U.S. in global trade. But the style and the approach will be completely different. The Trump administration will continue with a fairly confrontational or pretty confrontational policy. A Biden administration is much more likely to go back to the negotiation table and use a mix of tariffs and other instruments and negotiations in order to get it going their way. So I think a lot of it is about style, but style, particularly in international economic relations and political relations, is very important. Is it going to be negotiation or is it going to be confrontation? That is another very important portfolio. Of course, there are big disagreements between both sides on, for example, health policy and things like that. But I do think that these kind of policies will probably be delayed a little bit before they will really be picked up by any of the two administrations. So I would say for the moment, recovery and trade are going to be driving elements in the two administrations.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think given the time constraints, we'll move on to the next section of our discussion, and we'll come back obviously to economics. I'm sure there will be more questions from the audience as well, and we can engage more with some of the nitty-gritties of different administrations going forward and in the next 4 years as well. If we go to the domestic politics, so obviously there are shifts that are going to happen. There are interesting consequences from this election in terms of the processes, in terms of the U.S. civics, in terms of how the generational change and other changes will affect the next few years and next election. But before that, I'll ask you again to do the poll. The poll relates to the immediate aftermath of the election, although the discussion will go much further and look beyond 2021 and later. But let's see what may happen, or what do you expect will happen after the election night. And you have choices on your screen, and I'll ask you to vote for your preferred option.
Can you hear me now?
think we'll close the poll in just 1 minute. And yeah, let's close the poll and see what we have. So the majority is that the result will be litigated in one or more states and appealed to the Supreme Court, but both parties will accept the result. And before I ask Trevor to elaborate and discuss the key issues in the U.S. Civics and domestic politics, let me turn to Harvey and see what are your reactions to the poll results. Do you expect that? Does that tally with your view?
Yes, pretty much. This demonstrates 58% through the Supreme Court resolutions, or more like relying on the constitutional process. And this is a test of the U.S. Constitutional process, whether they can handle a smooth transfer of power, right? And we also see 27% indicating that the defeated candidate refused to accept the outcome. I would, for the sake of scenario planning, rather than for prediction, what else might actually happen if someone, especially Trump, refused to leave the office, right? So what else could he do? Maybe he could declare a wartime presidency, right? So waging a war and stay on. And this is something that, if it happens, it will be a real test of the constitutional process.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Harvey. Over to you, Trevor, to give us your views about the poll and discuss the key and longer-term issues in U.S. domestic politics and implications.
Yeah, so I think I've got 4 or 5 areas that I might focus on in relation to domestic politics. And actually the first of them does kind of follow quite nicely from the result of that poll, because I think it's important to try to focus on the fact that there is a constitutional system which is holding at the moment, which has certainly been under strain and under attack in some ways from Trump as an individual particularly. But I think in a lot of ways the first Trump presidency, the first Trump term in office, has actually played out in ways that we might expect a presidency of this type to go, and that the checks and balances remain in place. We do have a constitutional system which is still adhered to by most Americans, is respected by most Americans, and so I think that does point to certainly there will be challenges, I think, to the outcome of the election. We've had President Trump already trailing the fact that he's not 100% convinced that the outcome of this election will be legitimate, I suppose, especially if he happens to lose, and there will be those legal challenges. But I think, as we saw 20 years ago, the system is in place to work through any of those challenges and to arrive at an outcome which is then generally accepted by all sides. I think it's important to, when we look back on the first term of the Trump administration, and perhaps if we look into the potential for a second term, to perhaps try to separate the president himself from his presidency. So by all accounts, Donald Trump is one of the most extraordinary, if not the most extraordinary individuals to take a seat in the White House. And his whole approach and often quite off the cuff and flippant remarks, his tweeting, etc., all sort of point to a president who wants to completely shake up American politics and do things very differently to any president there has ever been. But I think if we look at the sort of outcomes, the achievements that his administration has put in place domestically, they're not too far away from what we might have expected from any Republican administration. And so it's important, I think, to have that separation in the way that we think about this president as being really quite extraordinary. But in a lot of ways, the administration that he's presided over has been relatively ordinary in the way that it's conducted its business, the way it's conducted its relationship with Republicans in Congress. And so I think if we get a second Trump term, some of those attempts that he's made to sort of revolutionize politics in Washington and his sort of anti-Washington approach will certainly become consolidated to an extent, but as has been pointed out by Bart, the outcome elsewhere in these elections, particularly in the Senate, but also the strength of the majority that the Democrats might have in the House of Representatives, is going to really restrict this president. It's going to constrain the second term of Donald Trump, and so the extent to which that majority of the Democrats in both houses perhaps is achieved is going to be significant. If you start to get the gridlock scenario that we played out in the supporting document for this meeting, President Trump is going to start using his veto, and he's going to use that veto potentially very effectively, because it does seem unlikely that the Democrats will have the necessary 2/3 majority to override a presidential veto. So we will then be in the situation where that could lead to very little being achieved. But generally what's happened in second-term presidencies is that you do get more attempts to try to work around some compromises on particular issues, not least because a second-term president has got his eye on his legacy and what the outcomes might be going forward in terms of the way that history looks at his presidency. He doesn't want it to be, Donald Trump is the sort of self-stylized greatest president the United States has ever had, right? So he wants this to be a successful presidency, to be looked at as a successful presidency in the future. So we may see attempts at compromise from the president in the second term, which we haven't yet seen perhaps so far. In terms of longer-lasting effects, though, I think what has been said already about civic behavior in the United States, the president's own behavior has really stretched the limits of what is acceptable in American politics. The way that he has approached a whole range of issues, his use of social media, and also his use of traditional media. I mean, that extraordinary video that we saw a couple of weekends ago when he left hospital after being treated for coronavirus. The way that he has utilized the office to promote his own sort of power and personality, I think we're going to see much more of that going forward, whoever future presidents might be. And I think it's also significant the degree to which Trump has legitimized the sort of anti-government sentiments that have been very present in American society for decades, if not the whole of its history. But he's brought those much more into the foreground and made those sort of challenges much more acceptable than perhaps many of his predecessors had. All of this, I think, is likely to have very deep consequences for the Republican Party. If we do see a Trump victory, Trump's approach and Trump's positioning around various issues will begin to take greater hold within the Republican Party. I think for the first 4 years of this presidency, Republicans who perhaps don't agree with Donald Trump's positions, don't agree with the more right-wing aspects of the party, have held the line because they don't want to see the Democrats having too much control. They wanted a Republican in the White House. But those divisions within the Republican Party, I think, will grow if we get a second Trump term, but particularly if Trump does lose and if the Senate is lost by the Republican Party, we're going to enter into a period of great soul-searching within the Republican Party about how it comes back from that defeat. A Biden victory, on the other hand, could be really the making of the Democratic Party going forward. This is a time of sort of refreshing time for the Democratic Party, with lots of new blood coming through, lots of new thinking within the party. It does mean, though, I think, that even if Biden wins and we get that trifecta situation with the US Senate also being taken over by the Democrats, it's not going to be plain sailing for the Biden administration. There are a lot of divisions within the Democratic Party, and a lot of pressure will come from those younger members who sit further to the left of the party in terms of their ideology and their positions around all sorts of issues, ranging from healthcare to racial justice to gender equality to climate change. And you may well find that even a Biden presidency with a Democratic Congress is nothing like as harmonious as perhaps we might be thinking it would be going forwards, because those divisions within the party, I think, will play out in that relationship between White House and Senate. But we will, I think, if Biden does come into the White House, see very swift attempts to reverse the positions that the Trump administration has taken, particularly Trump's attacks on Obama's achievements as president and the democratic agenda more broadly. But as Bart has been saying initially, so much of that will pivot around the response to COVID-19 and whether the Biden administration has any different way of trying to resolve not just the health problems of COVID-19, but also all the structural and economic problems that have flown from it, will be really fundamental to how effective whichever administration we see come January. But particularly I think for the Biden administration, that will be a real challenge to try to do something different and more successful than we've seen the Trump administration manage to achieve.
Trevor, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I can, Nick. What a joy to have you on the call.
Can I ask you, Trevor, a question in two parts, which concern the issue of leadership? Because as you said towards the end of your remarks, Donald Trump has been a very innovative leader in how he has chosen to conduct himself in the role, but also to communicate with people, both the language, but also the medium of it. So the question in two parts is, what would different elections do to the scenarios do to the two parties? So for the Republicans, if Donald Trump does not win,
sorry, Nick, I've just lost you again. I can't hear there's a lot of interference on the line.
If Donald Trump were to lose, would that return us to a more traditional mode of, if you know, conduct and communication from a senior Republican? If Donald Trump were to win, do you think that would prompt the Democrats into what in Britain we would call an agonizing reappraisal, where they decide that perhaps we need to find our own more Trump-like communicator and political operator in order to connect?
Wow, that's a really big and interesting question. I think that what you're suggesting about the long-term impacts of Trump, we are going to see. I think that there is a sense among sort of political leadership within the United States that Trump has been incredibly effective at communicating with his supporters, with his base, in ways that's certainly been divisive, but has worked particularly well with those who share some of the positions that he's been willing to articulate. And the way that he has done that has really been quite extraordinary for a much more senior member of the society, if you wouldn't mind me saying that, to be able to use social media so effectively and so in such a way that it's not just the tweets that Donald Trump writes himself, it's the extent to which those tweets get reposted, whether critically or positively. Trump has been an absolute master, we've seen it over the last month, of gaining control and keeping control of the 24-hour news cycle and the social media cycle. And to do both those things, I think, is really quite extraordinary. And so whatever the outcome of this election, I think political leaders on both sides of the spectrum will be looking at the way he has done that. Maybe not to repeat the same kind of content, but to have that level of command and control over political messaging within both traditional and social media. I think that is a really major consequence that we're going to see of this presidency and this particular president. In terms of the soul searching, yes, I think whichever party loses the presidential election, particularly if that's coupled with losses in the Congress as well, is going to go into a period of serious soul searching. For the Republicans, I think that will probably be far more difficult actually than it will be for the Democrats. I think for the Republicans, they will really be looking around for what the new way forward might be, because they've had such in a sense, a radically different leadership style from someone who isn't by any means a traditional Republican. To look for where to go next, I think, is much more difficult for the Republican Party. The Democrats do have great divisions within the party, but those divisions stem much more from a new generation of Democrats who are coming through. I hate to use the term New Democrats because we've had that before, but this is an entirely different generation. It's a 21st century party that is being developed at the moment by the Democrats. So much of what we see in the senior leadership of both the Republicans and the Democrats, I think, is very 20th century politics. But there is a very strong force within the Democratic Party to bring forward a much more forward-looking 21st century style of politics and thinking about the various issues that the United States is facing. And that's being matched by demographic changes within the United States that also give advantages to the Democratic Party going forward in its elections. And so I think actually whatever the outcome of this presidential election, the future looks very bright for a refreshed Democratic Party. I'd be more worried about what will happen to the Republican Party should they not only lose the presidency but also lose the Senate.
Thank you. Amalia, one more?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that, Nick.
I'd say, Amalia, do we have time for one more? Okay. If I can ask you again, Trevor, another. What's been quite interesting at various points during the crisis is President Trump seems to have chafed against the limits imposed by the Constitution on what the federal government can or cannot do. And it's particularly the case in terms of coordination, especially with Democratic governors rather than Republican ones. Is this something that you see is going to be potentially a feature no matter who wins the election? But is federalism itself, or a particular balance between center and state, up for discussion, or is this actually really a side issue? Is it something of a moment, and there are plenty of other things to argue about, to contest rather than this one?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a side issue. I wouldn't call it that at all. I think that certainly the 2016 Trump campaign based itself largely on an anti-federal government approach to getting inside the federal government, which is somewhat ironic. But Trump is continuing in office, I think, to try to put forward the idea that that the way the constitutional setup is ineffective, is unable to give the outcomes that he believes the United States requires, both domestically and internationally. I think a Biden presidency would be far more respectful of the federal setup, the constitutional framework. You've seen that in the way that the Democrats in the House of Representatives have argued that you need to follow constitutional processes, you need to be respectful, you need to adhere to the ways that have been established of doing politics over the 200 years or more of the United States. That will I think come back much more to the foreground if you do have the Democratic Party in control of the two, the legislative and the executive branch. But of course, where Trump has been successful within that constitutional framework is by putting his justices onto the Supreme Court, and so he will, again somewhat ironically, have this lasting constitutional impact, even though he himself has perhaps quite frequently actually has shown a good deal of kind of disrespect or lack of belief in the constitutional systems that are so important to the running of politics in the US. But I think that anti-federal sentiment and anti-federalism sentiment has been very strong throughout American history. It's been given a spotlight in this administration. It won't be given that level of spotlight, I think, by a different administration, but it's not going away, and it's an area that needs to be addressed and I think properly understood by political leaders in order to carry forward the political agendas that they wish to deliver on, because it is important, obviously, to have the states on side, but you've also got to somehow manage that level of anti-federalism that exists within large swathes of the population.
Thank you, Trevor. Should we move on now to the next section? President Trump was elected promising to reset trade relations with China, and he's certainly gone about trying to do so with vigor. We have had a tariff war, then a trade truce, then more tariffs, and now sanctions on Chinese tech firms. So in a moment I'll ask Harvey to open our discussion on US-China relations, but first let's go to a poll. How serious is the current impasse and how lasting will it be? And there are your options. That it will fade eventually and it will be resolved, the trade barriers will remain and the two powers will rub along uneasily with the possibility of selective cooperation internationally, that we're on a path to two separate economic blocs, and particularly tech systems, and a fairly chilly political relationship, or indeed that this is the start of something much, much more serious, a new Cold War albeit one very different from that which we knew in the 70s, 80s, 60s. Okay, we have the results in the poll now, and broadcast results that people see. So, firstly, can I ask Trevor briefly your reaction to the poll results? There you go. Not worst scenario at 59%, and then a full separation at 27%.
Yeah, I think I'm surprised actually at the level of expectation that there won't be an improvement going forwards. I wonder if that has any indication of where our participants think the outcome of this election is pointing. But yes, I mean I do think it's, and I was going to say this in my comments on foreign policy, but I'll say it here instead, that we know the positions that Trump has been taking on China, but the Biden campaign has also been, Biden has had to be very critical of China and to recognize the perceived threats that China poses economically and otherwise to the United States going forwards, because there is such a strong belief within his own party that China poses those threats. So I think in that respect we are likely to see a continuation of a sort of competitive, somewhat cooperative relationship going forwards, which I suppose is not that different to the positions that were taken with China prior to Trump becoming president. So yeah, I think that the outcome there is probably the poll that's probably the question that or the point that I would have also cast my vote for. So, but watch this space.
Harvey, over to you. Are you equally optimistic?
I'm far less optimistic. So let's look at the China-U.S. relations first. The trade war, Trump waged trade war with China, but also with other partners, right? With the EU, with Canada, with Mexico, with Japan. So that's not necessarily against China per se. But I would see the overall relationship between the two countries have actually made a big turn, a U-turn back to the origin. If you think about how the relationship started, this phase of the relationship, that is when Nixon visited China, right? So that relationship started from the two enemies coming together in order to actually, fight against a third enemy, a common enemy, right? That's the Soviet Union. So they got together because of a common enemy. And then we entered a period of common interests. So the two countries are so interwoven in terms of their interests, economic, right, and in terms of investments, in terms of other policy initiatives, and also in terms of cultural exchanges and all that. And now we are entering an uncertain phase where maybe people, especially I think both parties in the U.S. are looking at China as a threat, and they make the judgment based on the values differences. So if we think about when two sides see each other as a threat, what will happen? In all human nature and in all animal nature, right? If you see the other side as a threat, there's three things you do, right? You run away, so that's a flight, or you fight, or you freeze. And in this case, I think the U.S. still has the upper hand in terms of power, and the U.S. would resort to fight. So I'll use the fight as a more general term, which may cover both Cold War and the Hot War. Of course, in those scenarios we are familiar with, at least we still remember in history what they look like, right? So I think what I would like to, for everybody to think about, what will be the unconventional parts of the fight, aside from the Cold War and the Hot War. We already see that, and we already see a cyber war, right? We see the technology war the U.S. is waging against China. we see probably in the international organizations, multilateral organizations, at the World Health Organization, and maybe soon the WTO, and even at the UN, they become a battleground for the two countries. And of course, there'll be diplomatic war. Say maybe the U.S. will actually build a closer tie with Taiwan, which is a very big triggering issue for the Chinese sense of sovereignty, right? That may trigger a regional conflict. And if a conflict materializes into a military confrontation and the U.S. got involved, and then the NATO, by the treaty, the NATO countries will have to side along with the U.S. And what will be the economic relations? What will be the companies, multinational companies from Europe and the U.S. in China? What will they do, right? Because of that siding. Of course, they don't want to choose side for the economic interest, but when that comes, right? So that will be a whole different scenario, triggered by all different ways of confrontation or different ways of fighting. There could be even more like a legal fight. The U.S. may use its legal system that has the power to intervene internationally. So that might actually lead to an even more unprecedented decoupling. So with all this, being prepared, and all this, might actually be used as I don't think, the U.S. would like a prolonged hot war with China or even a Cold War. But with all these means together, that might be a very strong threat, right, against any other counter fight. So this may trigger certain confrontations that may lead to unpredictable results. So that's the kind of scenario I'm more concerned about, because we are familiar with all the other things. Yeah, and in terms of this will be the short end of the horizon. So this sort of extreme situations may be worthwhile to entertain. Hopefully it will not happen, but if it happens, we'll get prepared for it. But on the longer end of the horizon, how the two countries can come back to more like a normal relationship, or if China eventually decouples from the rest of the world. Of course, China doesn't want to do so, but maybe if China is forced to be like that, how the two sides can come back together. I believe in the long term, I have a very positive view, because after COVID, there will be a worldwide recovery, and the world will need both sides, right, to get that moving. And China is a big market and also is a growth engine, so the world will need that. And before that can happen, a fundamental psychological process has to go through. You start to actually see each other not as a threat. And that could be the result of one side winning against the other. The other side is significantly weakened, no longer a threat, or some kind of change, right, of one side or the other would make each side feel that we can still be friends, right? So after the threat stage, and then we enter into a mutual understanding, knowing each other well, and then started to have a transactional relationship. And further down the road, if you rebuild confidence and trust, you may have a transformational relationship going forward for the world. So that, I think, will happen in the long term. And so whatever we do in the short term, don't forget about, we need to go back to that future. So don't really go one side or the other entirely. Just leave a seed for the future. That's what I think.
But we can't hear you.
Can I chip in a quick question for Harvey?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, Harvey, I think when it comes to international economic relationships or international relationships in general, style versus substance matters a lot. Style is very important here. So even though substantially, I very much agree that Biden and the Trump administrations are not all that far apart on the way that they perceive the threat. The style is going to be completely different and can really influence the outcome here. So
if you look at the poll that we showed earlier, the second option, that is going to be a tense relationship, is much more the result of a Biden approach to, be at the table, but, do threats and go back to the table and things like that, versus two different worlds of, a US-dominated and a China-dominated economic environment, which is the much more confrontational style that the Trump administration is pursuing. So aren't the outcomes going to be very different?
Yes, definitely I agree with you. The styles will be very different under Trump or under Biden. And Biden, both will be more predictable, right? We know what Trump will do, we know what Biden will do, and Biden will be more traditional, will be more multilateral, and it will be more of a mixture between values, especially the human rights, democracy, that kind of values clash, but also more closer economic collaboration. Under Trump, I think it's more of one winning entirely against the other. It's one either or kind of situation. So he's more. If you think about, as you said earlier, about his legacy on the second term, right? The legacy could be, to become someone like Ronald Reagan, who brought down the Soviet Union, right? So if he achieves the goal to get rid of the Chinese regime, he will go down to history in a big way. So maybe so that's a possibility. But if we think about the Biden administration, right? Maybe even he has his own way and styles. He may be seriously constrained by the hawks in the Republican Party or people in the Trump administration, even though they are not in power. They will probably still have a way to force Biden to do certain things. So it will not be a free Biden agenda, I guess.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Harvey, and Bart as well, Nick. Let's move on to the foreign policy. It's actually a great segue to foreign policy and look beyond the China-US relations, which is one of the most important ones. But there are obviously others we can look at. And obviously, Trump has taken a different course, as we all have been discussing all this time during his presidency. Allies have been unsettled, international agreements appended. The US has broken new ground in its efforts to denuclearize North Korea. In some parts, obviously, it protected values, but in other parts, sort of change. So before I go back to Trevor, let's do our usual poll and see what you think would be the next role for the US, or the role of the US playing in global affairs in the next 4 years. And you have the options in front of you: America first, continued or deepening deterioration of relations abroad; second term, Trump seeking peace deals globally; multilateral relationships on a limited range of issues serving US interests; a return to multilateral relationships and leadership; and transformative global engagement with allies and adversaries. And let's see what we have with your votes. So we give about some minutes for the votes. Let's close the vote and broadcast results. Yeah, interesting. So we have multilateral leadership on a limited range of issues serving US interests. we have actually equally split America First and a return to multilateral leadership. So it's an interesting uncertainty, I would say, from the scenario perspective if we look at it. Let's go back to Harvey and pick your views. What do you think, your very quick reactions on the results?
Yeah, I think to me this looks like more of what we hope we hope it will be than what it may actually be. So that's my view. So 39% on a limited range. But if Trump wins the election again, I think it will be more bilateral. Because he's seen some limited success for that already. And if Trump wins and this China picture comes back again, if he wages a bigger fight against China, then he's going to change the current structure of a lot of the multilateral organizations, either forcing China out a bit or completely out, or basically set up an alternative organization. So that's what I see. It's not entirely multilateral based on equal participation. The other thing would be in the process of Trump setting up coalitions against China. He's actually right now Pompeo is actually pursuing a multilateral approach, right? Trying to form some kind of alliances on the regional stage and the global stage against China. So in a way, they are not really doing a lone fight, bilateral, but also trying to engage other countries as well. That's what I see from the China angle.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Avi. Trevor, over to you to tell us more about US's foreign policy going forward and its role.
Okay, and I think to say first of all, I think that poll reveals probably more about who our participants think is going to win this presidential election, perhaps than anything else, because I tote that up as probably 70% thinking that we're going to see a Biden presidency, come January. That I think it will make a really significant difference which of these individuals wins the presidential elections as far as foreign policy goes. Definitely in terms of approach, we're going to see a very, very different kind of President Biden around the world than we've seen President Trump. But there are really fundamental differences, I think, in the approaches that will be taken by a Biden administration compared with the Trump administration. So where Trump has been, a second Trump term, could well bring us greater unilateralism on the part of the United States, a sort of consolidation and entrenchment of America First attitudes and policy positions, and a really serious assault on the structures of the international order, which has taken place over the first 4 years, but I think they would double down on that during a second term if that was achieved. Versus on the other side, if we get a Biden victory, then you're going to see much more international engagement, multilateralism will return. But I do think, as the poll suggests, that even a Biden administration is still going to be putting, in a sense, America first. It will do so within a multilateralist framework, but the primacy of American interests will still be what drives American leadership in world affairs. Even though it comes with a very different tone and a different agenda, those priorities that are primarily coming out of Washington will still be what the Biden administration will be promoting in foreign affairs if that was the case, that they win. But we're looking at two very, very different worldviews here. I think if we get more of Trump and with Pompeo staying as his Secretary of State and his closest foreign policy advisor currently, and I think probably will be into the second term, it's a much more realist perspective, a much greater emphasis on state versus state relations, more power-driven and nationalistic in the way that the administration and the closest advisors perceive the world and how the world operates. And so with those sorts of attitudes continuing in place, you can see the kind of scenarios that Harvey was suggesting at the kind of worst end, if you like, of the spectrum, potentially coming to pass. If we get a Biden administration, it's back to the Obama administration position in a lot of ways. Greater emphasis on the complexity of international relations, the interconnectedness of issues, an emphasis on cooperation and engagement versus confrontation. So we will see a very, very different kind of administration if Biden is victorious. The consequences of this will be felt very quickly. The New START treaty with the Russians over nuclear weapons limitations is due to expire in February. If Trump is still president, it will expire. If Biden becomes president, I think he will do everything he can to work with the Russians to renew that agreement, extend it for a period of time, and then renegotiate for a longer term agreement. It's really significant because if that treaty is allowed to expire, it will be the first time since the early 1970s that the US and Russia have not had limitations on their nuclear arsenals, and it will open the door to the development of a whole range of new systems and potentially a new arms race between them. So that's really significant, and other international agreements as well. The future of them will pivot around which of these presidential candidates ends up winning the election this November. The Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, the future of many international compacts and international the role of the United States in international organizations is really on the agenda here, and it's getting very little coverage and very little attention really in the campaign. It's not at the forefront of what people are voting on, but the consequences will be really substantial. I do think though it's worth us taking seriously the prospect that a second term Trump may end up looking very different, especially the further into that second term that Trump would go. And again, as Harvey said, that allusion back to the Reagan administration, where a second term of Reagan had a much more, I disagree actually with the idea that Reagan won the Cold War as such, but I think did take steps during his second term to move the relationship with the Soviet Union to a much more cooperative and conciliatory position that enabled the end of the Cold War to occur. We could well see Trump taking a more conciliatory approach to a range of issues in order to build a lasting legacy. We've already seen his celebratory approach to the limited agreements that he's managed to reach in the Middle East and to some extent with North Korea. I think we would see a much more serious attempt at engaging in those really quite intractable issues in the second term of Trump, with this idea that he is the greatest negotiator, that he is able to achieve deals where all other presidents have failed, in his opinion. We may even see with Iran an attempt to develop some sort of new agreement going forwards, which is much more in the keeping of Trump's idea of America's interests than the Obama deal was. But I can see some form of re-engagement happening there, potentially. If Biden does win, if our audience is correct and we get a Biden administration, then I would expect a very immediate re-engagement with allies, an attempt to try to bring back those relationships that have been so heavily strained, both within NATO and in other parts of the world as well. And also probably a re-engagement, or at least a policy of engagement with adversaries as well, taking similar positions to the Obama administration, which of course Biden was a part of for those full 8 years, to engage with adversaries like Iran and to an extent China, to try to find common ground and work to cooperative solutions to the problems that they have and the different interests that they have. Final things to say on a Biden presidency, though. I do think actually that Biden might have a greater propensity to use force in foreign relations than the Trump administration has had. For all of his bluster and everything else, Trump has actually been quite limited in the extent to which he's used military force, particularly compared to recent administrations. Biden might be more willing to utilize the threat and potential use of American military force in order to achieve objectives in different parts of the world. He is also going to find that his domestic, the domestic agenda and the debates within the Democratic Party that we've already talked about are, I think, going to have an impact on his manoeuvrability in foreign affairs as well. Again, those sort of new and up-and-coming forces within the Democratic Party are much more interested in so-called new security threats. So they'll want to have a heavy emphasis within foreign policy on climate change, on health, on migration, on various other issues that traditionally have kind of been sidelined compared with military and economic considerations, whilst he'll also be pulled by the more traditional wing of the party that thinks those are the main threats and that it's on the military and economic side that the focus needs to be. So again, as we said on the domestic front, I don't think it will be plain sailing for a Biden administration, and there will be a lot of different pressures pulling in different directions for him as president on the foreign policy side, just as there would be on the domestic front.
Great. As you were speaking there towards the end, I was probably right. It would be interesting to see.
Yeah, Nick, it's very, very quiet. I can just about hear you, but it's very, very quiet.
Let me try and speak back. I thought it would be interesting to see analysis ordinance model structure as loose in his first term versus Barack Obama versus George W. Bush. I suspect you're right. There actually wasn't that much. Trump has been relatively specific president. But I wanted to ask you about the possibility if Biden were to win, given these domestic pressures on him, COVID, given on the other hand the world demand US re-engagement.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Nick. It is really hard actually to hear the question. I think the microphone seems very muffled. I'm picking out little bits.
Okay. Let me hand over to Amalia now.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Just a quick reminder before I ask some questions to Trevor. If any of the audience have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat box, and we'll definitely take them back and feed to our speakers. Just to touch on what you said, Trevor, looking at turning the clock back, sort of that's somehow our hope, or the hope of those who think about the future. But the world has moved on since the 2016. And how do you think, for example, the adversaries will react to Biden's presidency? How they will get back? Will they try to test the resolve of the U.S.? And as you said, if the Trump administration or the second Trump term will be slightly different and more reconciliatory, how do you think those two sides, the adversaries on the one side and the allies, will respond to both Biden and
yeah, I mean, it's obviously quite difficult to predict exactly how the reaction will be. I think there's always an expectation when you get a new presidency that adversaries in particular will see it as an opportunity to try and push back against US objectives internationally, to challenge the US on a range of issues, and perhaps be fairly confrontational to begin with, just to see what the reaction of that president will be. And I think there will be a lot of pressure on a new Biden administration, if that's what we end up with, to sort of demonstrate that they can't be pushed around, that then just because you don't have Donald Trump as president anymore, that doesn't mean that the United States is suddenly going to kind of just go along with whatever other countries want it to do. As I said, I think whichever president we have, American interests and the definition that each administration will have of the national interest will still be a major driving force of how that administration approaches its foreign policy. And so adversaries will need to be careful, I think, if they think that Biden is going to be perhaps something of a pushover and that they can gain some advantages if he does come into power in January. On the other hand, if Trump is re-elected, then I think what both allies and adversaries have been doing for the last few months is sort of holding fire a bit and waiting to see what happens, and perhaps particularly for the allies, hoping that there is a change in Washington, and they get a Biden administration that's likely to be more cooperative, more multilateral. If that isn't the case and we get a second Trump term, then I think within allied capitals there's going to have to be some really quick thinking about how best to engage with a second Trump administration, because it could go either one of those ways I think that we've laid out. It could be that you get a much more forceful consolidation of this idea of America first, and that the second term Trump really does try to reimagine and rework the international order in ways that allies will really want to resist. On the other hand, if he is to take a more conciliatory turn, that might be something that allies will feel that they can influence and perhaps move in certain directions. Certainly on Iran, for example, the European allies have held fairly firm on their position that engagement with Iran is the best way to contain its ambitions and to ensure that there is a non-threatening nuclear future for Iran. Those positions I don't think will shift whichever of the presidential candidates wins, but the way that they can then try to influence policy will be very much affected by what the outcome is. And I think if we get a second Trump term, it's potentially going to invigorate America's allies into becoming more independent and working with each other to try to achieve the objectives that they would like to see, rather than, if it is a Biden administration, there might be more cooperation and engagement with the US on a whole range of issues, beginning with Iran, but also China and other areas as well.
Thanks very much, Trevor. We just got probably like 1 or 2 minutes just to elaborate from the audience about comments on Russia-related issues and sanctions outlook, just very briefly, and we pass on to James for the market.
So I think again, if we get a Biden presidency, that there is a lot of strong feeling within the Democratic Party that Russia is a serious threat to US interests and that it needs to be confronted and contained in its ambitions and its meddling in international affairs and also in domestic US politics. And so I would expect actually Biden to be rather stronger in his willingness to criticize Russia and to try to maintain a strong position in relation to economic sanctions. Trump, on the other hand, as we know, has this rather strange but positive relationship with Putin. That again, in the second term, we may well see that growing closer again, and a Trump administration would try to resist any pushes by a Democrat-controlled Congress to deepen the sanctions regime. But that would be a point of serious contention between the two branches of government, I think, because if you do get a Democrat-dominated Congress, both Senate and House, there will be stronger pushes there to try to take the Russian threat more seriously. And so it may be that this is an area where a second-term Trump would find it very difficult to maintain his position relative to that's being advocated by other parts of the US government.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Trevor. I think we'll come back to discussion on foreign policy if we have time. There is some noise on the line. Let's turn to the market and probably start straight away with the poll, which you'll see on your screens now. And please feel free to cast your vote. We'll give 1 minute and close the poll in 1 minute. Given the challenges the economy will face over the next 4 years, what in your view would be the biggest financial market success for the next presidential term? And you have further stock market gains, the Federal Reserve able to raise interest rates, dollar strength, and US government borrowing costs being under control. If you choose one of those 4, and let's close the poll and see what we have. So we are 42% on U.S. government borrowing costs staying under control and 31% for the stock market gains. I'll probably go straight to James for both your reactions and your views, given that we're very tight on time.
Yeah, sure. No, I think that is very interesting, because I personally think it's going to be the Federal Reserve able to raise interest rates, because I think that broadly encompasses all of those issues that we've got addressed in the poll. So if I just address the stock market to start with, of course, we know that Donald Trump has suggested don't look at opinion polls, look at the stock market to judge me and my successes. And of course, we have seen a pretty good run through what has been a torrid economic, health and market environment over the last few months. I would actually argue that I think equity markets are more likely to rally for longer under a Biden presidency than Donald Trump. That's counterintuitive to what the survey suggests. If you see surveys for managers, it's overwhelmingly Donald Trump, low tax, low regulation, that's the best environment for equities. But I think, as Bart mentioned earlier, I think stronger regulation, higher taxes, that's not a near-term issue. We're going to be seeing reflationary fiscal stimulus in the very near term, especially if it is under a Biden presidency with all the branches of government under the Democrats. So I think actually that regulatory environment, tax environment, it's not going to be as much of a hindrance as some participants in the market sphere, particularly over the next 1 to 2 years. I think also under a Biden presidency, to tie into some of the other comments from Trevor and Harvey, for me, the trade environment is very, very important in all this. We saw as trade tensions escalated through 2018, 2019, when those peaks hit, it was challenging for the equity market. And I sort of look back, I was on a panel with Pascal Lamy, the former head of the WTO, about November last year, who was, of course, the EU Trade Commissioner. And just to underline this point on trade and how it could shift, he made the point that he speaks to Emmanuel Macron. He asked Emmanuel Macron, why don't you work with the US on trade? If the US and Europe work together, they're much more likely to extract the concessions on intellectual property, on trade, on policy like that China is more likely to give them if it's faced with the US and Europe together rather than the US alone, and it can split that economic bloc. And he said, well, look, Macron asked him, and Trump's response was, no, back out, this is my thing, this is my deal, this is me. Likewise, we had Peter Navarro here in New York late last year, speaking around the WTO meetings, and he was asked the same question, why do you not work with Europe? And his response, in typical bombastic fashion, was, Europe's in the pocket of China. Why would we want to work with them? And the idea here being that, basically countries like Italy have signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. So when you've got that sort of hostility between Europe and the US, I don't see that changing if we do get a Trump second term, whereas if we do see a Biden, I think there will be reconciliation. I think the relationships with Europe would get much better, and therefore I think those trade aspects would be much improved. So that too, for me, is another big potential equity market support. We could actually see a better trade environment under Joe Biden as well. So putting it all together, if we push back on regulation, push back on taxes for a couple of years, we get a big fiscal stimulus and we get a better trade narrative, for me, that's a more positive environment for equities. But looking at some of the other issues, dollar strength, we know the US has historically had this strong dollar policy, it sees as this important aspect. But I would argue that, dollar strength is more a relative aspect rather than an absolute. So, we're looking at what's going on in Europe here, sat in America, we're looking in horror what's happening in Europe in terms of the COVID spike, in terms of the risks of more containment measures, economic shutdown. That sort of environment is going to play into the dollar. So for me, dollar strength, it can be swung around by so many other factors, not just the domestic positiveness of the presidential policies. Looking at government borrowing costs, we know that the US is going to be borrowing the equivalent of about 25% of GDP this year as the cost of dealing with the pandemic really build and more stimulus comes that's likely to be spending-led and isn't going to be offset by higher taxes. So that deficit is going to remain a strong, elevated aspect of this with high debt levels. How is that going to impact government borrowing costs? Well, if there is a plan, if we do get reforms, if we do eventually see taxes rise, then that actually can help that story. But of course, we've also got to remember the Fed is there as well. The Federal Reserve is always in the background, and we've heard so much about yield curve control or yield curve targeting as an aspect of Fed policy. So the Fed can still come in and also help limit the upside for US government borrowing costs. So for me, personally, the biggest sign of success is when you combine that all together, it's got to be the Fed. The Fed has told us that they don't think they will raise interest rates until 2024. If you as a president can deliver an economy that can create jobs, that can create growth, and you can convince the Fed that actually, no, we need to raise rates earlier, that for me is the biggest sign of success. If we can also get an onward positive upward sloping yield curve, that too, great news. We shall see if that happens.
At the same time, though, if interest rates are going to increase earlier than is expected, it raises questions about the borrowing cost. So the success may actually bite back in terms of making a president less popular. So ultimately, it also depends on how much GDP gets delivered on the basis of it. So, I think if we have a 3% GDP growth rate, we'll be much more comfortable with raising interest rates than if we're at sort of 2.5% or 2%, whereas, most of the forecasts would point at less than 2%. So I think it's also a little bit of a mix of how, interest rates, inflation, and GDP growth come together here.
Yeah, and it comes back to your point on investment as well. If you can get the multipliers of good investment, if we do see Biden, for example, getting that $2 trillion in green energy, where you see this revolution in key industries, generating jobs, generating growth, and that could be the catalyst for that. As you say, if it's just sort of giving money, giving a $1,200 check to people or filling in potholes, it's not going to do as much. So the composition of that stimulus is so important to this story too.
Yeah, so I would like to raise a point, because if you look at the 2008 financial crisis, right, the way to fix this is to fix the financial system and providing enough liquidity, quantitative easing, whatever. And this time around, it's COVID. So that hurts the real economy. So unless we have a way to, well, if we don't run into a situation of a huge second wave or third wave, then that will be fine, right? We'll have a recovery. If we do run into a prolonged, period of inactivity, right? People cannot go to work and things like that. I think purely lowering interest would not really help that much, as and will not really be seen as a positive sign for the stock market, because it's not just the borrowing cost; it's just getting people back to work. That's more fundamental. So unless we see ways to get around it in the worst case scenario, I would be cautious about the stock market and all that. So.
No, I think there is certainly a nervousness as to what the stock market has been doing. Can you justify some of the moves when you look at the NASDAQ up 30% year to date, despite the economic environment that we are in? So I think there are going to be challenges over the next quarters on this, and the few further gains in equities may be more challenging to come by as we start to see the structural changes within the economy that result from COVID. For example, do we need as many hotels? Do we need as many airlines? Those sorts of aspects that we're still trying to support these industries, but there will come a point at time when there is where we do have to actually see where the dust settles on this. So I think there could still be many, many challenges out there.
Thank you. Thanks very much, James and Bart and Harvey, for interesting discussion, and of course Trevor. I think we're almost at the end. We have 1 minute to close our session. So unfortunately, we couldn't ask more questions on the market. I don't see any questions coming from the audience as well. So I'll take that everything you said was well taken and gives a lot for food for thought. For those who are claiming CP credits, just a reminder that to hold on until the end the call closes, and then to click on the link from us, from Oxford Analytica and the conference board. Thank you very much again to James, Harvey, Trevor, Bart, and Mark at ING for collaboration and for a very interesting discussion. I was asked to also remind that our series continue, and feel free to register for the next webinar next month, and one after that in December on trade and IP. And thank you again very much to the audience as well for joining us. And for now, goodbye from all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.